I want to thank everybody um, for coming to this course, and then also especially for those of you who've been making some effort, hopefully, in trying to take extra time beyond the sessions to maybe do some of the meditations and reflections on what's been covered. In sort of looking back at preparing for this course, I can share with you that it's my own self-reflection about actually presenting this course gave me sort of an additional challenge in this sense, in the sense that it's a hard topic. It's a hard topic for Buddhists who spend time on this topic purposefully. And then beyond that, for those of us that maybe aren't practicing Buddhists, taking the concept of this idea that I, me, mine, as we normally experience it on a daily basis in our lives, that there's something wrong with that, that it's mistaken. And then how to maybe come into this topic and participate, like in listening to these lectures and studying this topic. I do have an appreciation for how challenging that could be. I've been studying this topic and meditating about this topic for decades, and it's still very challenging for me. So there's actually a very deep, what I'm trying to share with you is a deep sense of gratitude and thankfulness for those of you who persevered, so to speak. Then maybe some of you are way more advanced than me, so in terms of understanding the true nature of all things. And so you're attending this course to help me by allowing me to teach it further. That helps me understand this topic further as well. So I mean that seriously. So that's kind of how I experience the world. So, sort of with those introductory remarks about my thankfulness and gratitude to all of you who've persisted. I'm glad you're all here today. And what we're going to do in today's class is I'm going to cover the other steps in the sevenfold reasoning meditation practice, which are all pointed directly at this object of negation, which is the topic that we focused on a lot in the third session, which was the last session of this course. Very important, which is the I, the idea of self, the idea of an I, and not in a conventional sense negating that, but in an ultimate sense, meaning that it doesn't inherently exist. It's not fixed. It's not permanent. And that's what again, just to refocus, like what's the purpose of doing these meditations? That's the sort of logical reason for doing these meditations. Today, I'm going to go through the rest of the meditations, but also I'm going to take that reasoning of like why we would do these meditations to negate that false sense of self, like to a discussion towards the end of this session about why that really matters, which I've talked about pretty extensively, knitted through the previous lectures that I've given. But I'm going to talk about it further in terms of why it matters, in terms of what this class was purporting to do, which is that in the process of doing this, that one could find real and lasting happiness. That's even in the subtitle, if you will, of the course. So that might be a little fuzzy for some of us. I know it has been for me, again, as I reflect back over the years and even decades of studying this topic, that it could kind of the intellectual process, the analytical process of doing these meditations and doing these reflections and looking at like the non-self and, okay, I get it, but not only why does it matter, but how could that actually lead to something I could do each day that creates something that I can work with to move in the direction of, quote, real and lasting happiness. And that's even what George Harrison infers. He only infers it in his I, me, my personal experience that I've shared with you repeatedly at the beginning of each one of the courses. And it's on the course description page at the website. He talks about this, but he doesn't really then take us to the next step, so to speak, which is, okay, if I accept all this and if I understand all this through these process of analysis, using the sevenfold reasoning, and even reflecting it back on the frame of reference that I've asked all of you to look at this topic through, which is that wheel of life, how life works, essentially, lens. He doesn't really go there. So that's what we've been attempting to do here in this course, but I want to take it further and connect all the dots. So that's the goal, big goal today, to get to a place that when we leave this session today and we end the course, that there's a map forward, maybe a clear understanding of how there is a process to find real and lasting happiness as one has taken the time to learn about the mistaken experience of how we experience ourselves moment by moment in life, and how that is the cause of suffering. And that's big stuff. It's conceptual, but I want to contextualize it further than I've done in previous sessions. So that's really what we're going to be trying to do today. So we'll start by talking about the focus that I want to narrowcast us into, and I want us to remember. It's the most important thing, and it is the following. In terms of what we are observing, the object that we're observing in this process of negating the idea of self or I, the object of observation, which are, when we're looking at ourselves, is the five aggregates, which we've defined previously and we've done specific meditations about. Or it could be an object outside of ourselves, so to speak, which is the experience of interacting, of dependently arising with an object outside of ourselves, like the chariot. Short meditation that we did and I gave out in the last handout of meditations. So those are the objects of observation. I just want to be really clear about, like, what are we talking about when we're talking about an object that we're looking at, and then what is it that we're actually trying to negate? So what I want to make clear here is that we're not negating the object of observation, meaning our aggregates or some phenomena outside of ourselves, meaning we're not trying to negate anything as an object. Object is a factor in our moment by moment experience. We're either experiencing something within ourselves, our thoughts, our speech, as I'm doing right now, or actions that we're taking, and dependently arising within my own inner dialogue, or as I'm bringing that inner dialogue and experience into interaction with something outside of us. So we talk about those two objects and containers, the objects of observation of self, or the I, or phenomena, like the chariot. So I just want to make very clear that the object of observation is not what we're trying to negate. We're not trying to say that doesn't exist. It functions. Everything functions, and therefore has existence conventionally. And that's kind of the rub. But rather what we're trying to focus on here is that what we're negating, the object that we are negating, is this is it. This is what it's all about. Is the arising conceptions that happen every single moment in our stream of consciousness. So in a sentence, it would be stated like this: it is not the object of observation, but rather the conception itself that is the causal factor in bringing about all suffering. So that's a mouthful. And so that's why we're zeroing in on conception. And that goes to circling back to the wheel of life and how all our experiences arise through the creation of conceptions that flow in our minds every single moment as it takes place. And I will bring this up just to underscore it. Got to share my screen when I say bring it up. So give me a second. There we go. So when we talk about this, where I just took us to, I'm taking us back to what hopefully all of you can see on your screen, which is the center of the diagram from the wheel of life, which is essentially a map of how things work. And in this philosophical and frame of reference, the supposition is that all our experience arises from this inner circle, symbolized by this boar or pig, which is the mistaken identity of things existing themselves, inherently, permanently fixed. And then how that leads in an endless circle. That's why each one of these animals are holding on to each other's tail. It creates a repeated process. But that boar or pig represents that misapprehension, that lack of understanding how things really exist. And it leads to what's symbolized by the rooster, which is attraction, clinging to things. Clinging to something might not be in itself something we could label as bad. But if we do it mistakenly, ignorantly, it leads to trouble. It leads to lots of trouble. We can spend the rest of the class just talking about the troubles that occurred in the last 24 hours in our individual lives, our collective lives, in the world. It goes on endlessly. It's unfathomable. And the opposite of that is represented by the snake, which is aversion. Things that we try to push away, again, mistakenly. Now, pushing things away in and of themselves may not be something we could label as bad, but if it's done not understanding its true nature, it could only lead to trouble. And we could look at what's just happened in the world in the last 24 hours with wars going on all over the world, and maybe something that each one of us have thought just ourselves in our own experience this morning about something that we read in the paper or thought about when we were thinking about something that happened last night it is from the mundane to the sublime. And I can't underscore that enough. And then in the context of that endless cycle of experience, sentient beings like ourselves, we represented by this next circle, which is split in half, we partake in virtuous or non-virtuous activity. And the reason I went here, as I was talking about the object of negation not being the things that we're looking at, but rather their nature, is because it is in doing this endless process of what happens with the endless dance between the boar or pig, the rooster, and the snake, creating not mistaken experiences, but rather how we identify them as existing inherently. That leads us to practicing either virtuous or non-virtuous activities of thought, speech, and mind. And I've talked about that in previous classes. I explained how that works with our stream of consciousness, and that every moment we're doing that. And in our stream of consciousness, we're planting through our actions of thought, speech, and physical actions. We're planting kleshas, or seeds, karmic seeds, that then ripen sometime later, amplified further, over and over and over, and fed. Remember, I talked about being fed by the three poisons, which are what this process of the boar, the rooster, and the snake represent, of mistakenly clinging to things or pushing them away. Everything boils down to that. All of our mental conceptual, here comes that word, conceptual experiences are driven by this fundamental process that goes on with the three poisons. All our mental afflictions, all of our experience of life in any shape or form, if imbued to some degree by virtuous activities we've done, even if they've been done in a misapprehended way, not knowing the true nature of something, people can do things that are good. They do. You don't have to be imbued with wisdom to really function this way. You could have pleasant experiences. If you do non-virtuous activities, they ripen into unpleasant experiences or suffering experiences. But because our experiences are not informed with understanding the true nature of things, which is what Harrison was talking about, it's at best mixed. It's mixed. We have good days, we have bad days, we have good emotions, we have bad emotions, we have mental states that come and go with the ripening of our moment by moment experience that's informed 100% by these fundamentals. And that's why it's important to understand the true nature of reality. And it's important to understand that why are we trying to negate the conception, the experience, the thought that we have constantly of something having its own self-existence, its fixed, permanent existence. It is nothing more than impermanent. Everything's impermanent. We are impermanent. Everything is impermanent. And understanding that is step one of liberation. And then step two is what I'll circle back to at the end of our session. And that's why it's important to understand the statement that we're not trying to negate the objects themselves. We're not trying to negate our conventional self. We're not trying to negate conventional things, including our own aggregates. Rather, it's the mistaken identity of it. So it's the conception of that we're negating. And this is very important because we need to really avoid the idea of nihilism, or the opposite of that, which is things just don't even exist. Neither are true. So this is very important. So I share that with you just as a reminder that, and a refocus on what we're actually doing here. And when we apply these meditations, then this is what we're doing. So, some of you might be able to bring that into focus and go, I get it. And some of you might not be able to. I encourage you to further explore these ideas and then see why they might mean something in your life. And again, I'll try to do a little bit more of a focus on that towards the end of the session. But for now, what we're going to try to do is walk through some important additional thoughts and information about the rest of the sevenfold reasoning process and how we can utilize that. And so that will involve sort of a talk through and then a quick sketch, basically just due to time, of those other meditations. And again, I'll supply you with the meditations as we move past the class, and we'll make it available on the website. And also any of you who have my email or on my mailing list for this class, I'll send it to you directly. So yeah, so that's really important. That's why I spent so much time on that. So the next thing I want to just bring up is another reason why we need to do these meditations. One can have go to a class like this, and one can, like, even pay close attention and take notes. But if one doesn't do the further work of doing reflection and then some type of really well-formed, I would say sort of ironclad lockdown, in terms of logic and reasoning process of analytical meditation, it's going to slip away. You will not be able to hold this frame of reference in your day-to-day experience and therefore be liberated from this normal way of experiencing things. So from an analytical point of view, it's important to understand that, because it gives drive and purpose and intent to, like, why, beyond going to a class like this, even if I do get it and I do see what is being taught, and I see the reasoning that's being applied here to actually create transformation in your life. It's essential to do this sort of these sort of practices, and to put it under a microscope just for a moment. The way you need to see how we normally experience things can be seen in the idea of what's called innate conception of a self. And that goes back to the wheel, what's happening just sort of innately, habitually, since we've been functioning as a person and experiencing things. And this is what we would call the habitual way of experiencing ourselves and phenomena. And from a Buddhist frame of reference, we talk about it in the context of since beginningless time. In the Buddhist cosmology, every sentient being has been in existence since beginningless time. So the habits one might form around innately experiencing things, non-analytically, not thinking about these things. Oh, wow, if that was your frame of reference, that's pretty powerful, a habit to break. But even if you don't use that as your frame of reference and you're just looking at your life here in as you are now, from when you were born into this life, think about all the things that we do, each one of us, that we habitually develop patterns of behavior for. And if they are rooted in this mistaken way of seeing things, as I'm talking about, then it's not enough. I think anybody can make the argument that it's not enough just to talk about it and listen closely, take good notes, and then not do the rest of the process. And that's why the three-stage process is so important. The three-stage process of learning, reflecting, and then doing specific types of meditation practices that will help you with the topic. And this is the other type of conception. This is the type of conception that you can acquire, not habitual, one where you can take habitual conceptions and create basically a replacement for it. And that's one of the things that doing this sort of study and reflection and analytical meditation can do. So the purpose of this short walk through the two types of how we experience things innately or habitually versus something we acquire intellectually, which is what we're doing here, is to show you how the latter is a tool that can be used in a purposeful way to remedy the problem. And it also can be used, it's a double-edged sword. Understand that in some circles, it's called artificial conception, meaning that it's intellectually acquired, and a lot of things can be intellectually acquired, including just replacing habitual, innate, non-analytical behavior with more of that. So, and you also could intellectually acquire other views of how life works. Human nature has the ability to freely choose, and to a degree, beyond habitually being influenced by our own predispositions, to choose whatever we might want to accept as how things really are. So it's a double-edged sword. But in this system, we are skillfully and intelligently using our ability to take on acquired conceptual or artificial processes, because they're kind of forced. We're forcing ourselves to do these processes, to do this kind of analysis, to get to something that at best is inferred. It's inferred in the sense that when we get through these sevenfold reasoning meditation practices, and if one really does them and works with them and has a clear, abiding experience of them, which is the latter half of the meditation experience after you do the analytical meditation, then at best, what the sevenfold reasoning meditation practice does is it leaves you at the end of each one of those 7 types of meditation with an understanding of what something isn't, not what something is, meaning the self. So it's inferred that it's none of these things. So that might sound like a little like an intellectual exercise, but it's important because it's inferred in the sense that it's not directly experienced. It's only through the process of negation that one can eliminate all the things that the self could be, and in the process, discover non-self. It's a negative. Remember, I talked about this in the first class, the first session. So we're not used to thinking about affirming something as being a negative. But that's why we use the phrase selflessness. What we discover is selflessness. What we discover is non-self. It's not a positive thing, something that you can hold in your hands and see directly or experience directly. Rather, it's only inferred by the conclusion that you come to at the end of each one of the meditations. So these are just sort of important markers I'm laying out here in the last session, because they're important to understand. And that's why in this system, we use negation as a process of analysis, this sevenfold reasoning. When we walk through the sevenfold reasoning, I'll bring the screen back up. Probably should just leave it on. Let's do this again. When we do this, I'll bring up the right screen. Here we go. It's pretty underscored by what I was just blabbering on about by looking at what they are, the sevenfold reasoned meditation practices. Look at what word it begins with, every single one of them, not. We're negating that the self is the aggregates, that the self is something other than the aggregates. that the self is not based on the aggregates, that the self is not inherently based on the aggregates, not inherently possessing the aggregates, not being just the composition of the aggregates, not being the shape of the aggregates. So it never, in a positive sense, directly allows us to put our hands on what the self is. The best we can do conceptually, here's that word again, is use logic and reasoning through the sevenfold reasoning meditation practice to identify what the self is not. And that's when we end up with that meditative experience where once we determine through each one of these steps that the self isn't any of these, after each one, we relax and hopefully comfortably and one in clarity with the conclusion that one gets at the end of each one of these steps. That's really, really, really important, because that's as far as this process is going to take you. And then labeling what that is that conceptually, it leaves you with an inferred definition or experience of non-self, of understanding that the self and all phenomena do not inherently exist, do not have a fixed and permanent nature. They only exist in, and then that's where we come to the conclusion of what is the self and how we experience it. And we'll zero in on that at the end of the session today. So kind of important to remember that as well, that there is this innate way, non-analytical way that we just habitually experiencing things. And the reason we're doing this meditation practice in the first place is to break that. And it goes back to, what are we breaking? We're breaking that experience that we've had since we've been in existence, which is to mistakenly experience things as existing itself and self-inherently. So that takes effort, that takes applying study and reflection and meditation. And that's why Chandra Kirti, there are other meditation practices, which I'll talk about also if we have time at the end, not do them, but talk about them, that tackle this same topic. But this is sort of the fundamental foundation of breaking that habit. So, as this is the last session, I wanted to do that reframing of like, what are we negating? It's actually the conception of inherent existent things, whether it's self or other phenomena, and then also to frame out for you how that works in the context of this system anyway, how life works. That's why I reflected back to showing you the inner circles on the wheel of life. And then further, why do we really need to do this? If we buy into that, then it's to break this and habits that we all have. And that's kind of putting it, that's as simply as I can. So it's this it took me a long time to get this, so it's hard for me to let go of it as I'm talking about it, as I'm trying to share it with you guys in this class. So what we're really changing or looking to change or striving to change is not our moment by moment experience of life. We're not trying to be nihilistic. We're not trying to be affirming that all things do exist in the way we experience them. We're trying to negate that, both those extremes, and come to the conclusion that what we're trying to work with here is negating the mode of how we conceptually experience every single moment, ourselves and phenomena, and the supposition here is that if one's able to do that, one can end suffering. And that's what I'll circle back to in terms of talking about how. if we're able to build this platform of reaching that inference experience of non-self, which is what Harrison talked about. Mr. Harrison, I keep calling him Harrison. George Harrison talks about in his experience of my, me, mine. So just to underscore that a little bit more, a great Buddhist scholar and yogi, Jason Kappa, says in his Essence of Good Explanation, which is one of his texts, the following: the conception of a person, the observation of which generates the thought I. That's really important. It's that dependent arising of observing that generates the thought I. There's something there that happens that generates that thought. Further, he says, in the conception of phenomena of one's continuum. So those things that manifest outside of us is also conceptual. These are the two selves, the self, mistaken identity of things outside of us, phenomena, in other words, and ourselves internally, our five aggregates and our experience of how we think of ourselves. These are the principal, what he calls fetters, which bind us to the experience of suffering. Therefore, these two conceptions are the principal basis which are negated through reasoning. Again, he's underscoring this, the importance of understanding that we're negating the wrong conception of how things exist, both ourselves and other things. So he's saying that this is the chief obstacle to be overcome. And that's why we do these types of practices. One is the conception of self, or the or what he calls internal phenomena. And then there's that experience of objects that we experience in our continuum, like the chariot, which you can substitute any object outside of us to fill that requirement. And that all leads to the experience of mind, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. So Chandrakirti, whose system this is, meaning this sevenfold reasoning meditation practice, says when worldly conventionalities are analyzed, so ourselves and others, through this sevenfold analysis, we find that they do not exist. And he means ultimately, not conventionally. And he continues and says that. He says they do, however, exist through non-analytical renown. That goes back to me making a big deal out of how we habitually experience things non-analytically, and why it's important to take on, at least while we're doing this class and doing reflections on this class, and maybe even doing the meditations that are being offered, to become analytical. So we can see what it is that is the true nature of things. So he continues and says, therefore, a yogi, that's you and me, right? If we're doing these practices, when he analyzes the chariot and the person, we did that last session, through this series of reasonings, will penetrate the depths of reality very quickly. And that gets to what Mr. Harrison's imploring us to do as well. And why that's so important, I'll try to make as part of my wrap up at the end of the session today. So that kind of covers my introductory remarks. I wanted to do that in 30 minutes. It took 40, so I got to move a little faster. You have to realize that this topic is something we can meet every 2 weeks forever, every Sunday for 2 hours, and I would not run out of things to talk about. One, because I like to talk a lot, but secondly, this topic has got a lot of angles to talk about it. So what we'll do is talk through These, the rest of these processes, we're going to talk through these 7. We did meditation practice last session on the first one. And I outlined 6 reasons under not being the aggregates that we made part of that meditation. It was part of the handout that I gave out after the last session. So you should all have that. If any of you don't have that, you can reach out to me and I'll be glad to send it to you. And also Gloria from DNKL is putting those documents all related to the course, including the meditations, at the website on the calendar. They're under the calendar where you go to the calendar and you click on any one of the sessions for I, me, mine that are listed there. And you'll see down at the bottom, all these documents are attached. So they're always there for you as well. So today, what I'm going to do is walk through in a little bit more detail number 2, because number 1 and number 2 are really what it's all about, meaning this process of reasoning. I talked about this last session, but essentially the reasoning process here is identifying, doing the process of identifying our self or I not being the aggregates. And then if they're not, we move on to then identifying our self or the I as not being, or being something other than the aggregates. And if we can't find one or the other, we're not going to find a self or an I. And therefore, we won't have a mind to grasp onto. That's what breaks that cycle of the 3 poisons that I showed you in the, in this graphic, right? So it's important these are really the 2 important practices. The other 5, 3 through 7, are simply amplifications of these first 2. They further one's depth of understanding or experiencing inferentially when you get through the end of each one of these meditations, that the self or I not being one of these 7, it cannot, there's nothing left. There's nothing else it could be. There's the negation. We're not trying to replace it with something that, well, therefore it is this. It's really getting to that conclusion. So these are skillfully put together by Chandrakirti as additional meditation methods, number 3 through number 7, that are really variations on 1 and or 2. And further, I must say that as I walk us through these other meditations, one of the things that if you practice these that you'll find out is that you don't have to necessarily do all of them. Some people can do number 1 and number 2, and they've completed that process of negation that these reasonings give us. And they don't have to do the others. Some might have to do the others 2, meaning 3 through 7, in order to do that sort of further amplification or refortifying, because one might have an obstacle related to what each one of these processes of reasoning allow us to negate, in terms of negate in the sense of the self or I not being there. But one thing that you do have to do in these meditation practices is you have to do number 1 and number 2, because they contain all the potential things that self or I could be. They're either the aggregates or they're not. And if they're not, there's something else. And what is that? That's what happens through the process of number 1 and number 2. So you can't just do one or the other. You have to do both. So there's a minimum you have to do in this practice, and that's those two. And then the other ones are optional. So we spent a lot of time on the first one in not only the last class where we did the formal meditation of establishing that the I is not what it says in the meditation, the mind and body. We're essentially talking about the aggregates there. But if you can go all the way back to the first session I did and the 5 meditations that we covered on the individual aggregates in one form or another, those 5 meditations address this first, they fall within this first sevenfold reasoning meditation of not being the aggregates. If you recall, when you go through those meditations, and again, not that you would remember when I actually did them, I walked us through very quickly those 5 meditations over the first and second session. But at the end of each one of them, my guided meditation brought you to the conclusion that the self or I, as you identified it for yourself, is not one of those. And so we've spent a lot of time on this one already. We went through them before I identified the sevenfold reasoning process, because that's why I wanted to sort of jump you into the experience of these meditations. But if you reflect back and you look at those 5 meditations, I think I even have that window open here. These meditations, we're not going to go through them. We don't have time, but to remind you what we're talking about form, the meditation on form. And essentially, at the end of this process, we cannot find the self in form. So we've been doing, and then onward, I'm going to just continue the scroll here. We have the one of feeling. We did the same, we did that meditation practice. And through that process, we were able to get to the conclusion that we can't find the self in feelings. And then the next one was perception. Again, I'm avoiding going into details here because we've already done this and we don't have time today. But just so you can identify those 5 meditation practices, and the other 2 were in the second meditation session. The other 2 aggregates, the 4th being mental construction. And then the 5th being consciousness, which is probably the toughest, because I think most of us probably identify the self with consciousness, but maybe not, you know. So I bring these back up quickly, just as a reminder that we have, sorry, those are my notes for today. We have essentially already covered these, this first one in quite a bit of depth. So, and then we did the meditation, the formal meditation practice last session, right at the beginning of the last session, on this particular not being the aggregates, or the I not being the mind and body. And that is here in the last handout I gave. Let me go back to the top. And that's this one here. We did the meditation of the, after we did the meditation of the chariot. Sorry to be flipping through here. It's this one. So I'd given you in this handout the meditation first on establishing the process of identifying yourself, a self, so that you knew the object you were looking to negate. But remember, the object that you discovered to negate, you found in meditation because it's conceptual. It's not this thing I could say to you, okay, here it is. Meditate on this. With that said, there is the meditation of being able to look at an external object like a chariot and see that all phenomena has the same challenge in terms of being able to find an inherent existent chariot, or it could be a car or whatever. So that's why those first two meditation practices that I just went quickly scrolled past came before we did this one. So this actually is the first meditation of the 7. But to really underscore and get us comfortable with this, I had done those previous ones in the first 2 sessions that kind of covered, each one of the aggregates individually. So when we go back to the 7, then, as I said, the one that I want to really make sure I take a little bit of time to talk about today is this one, because it's the other one. It's the bookend one that's really important to bookend with the first one. And then the other ones, 3 through 7, are variations on the theme of either 1 or 2, or both. So that is a lot of reframing I'm doing here at the beginning of this session, because it's important to put everything we've talked about in the previous 3 sessions into some continuity and context, and not have it feel like just a bunch of conceptual information. So that's kind of why I did that. So what I'll do here now is talk about the next one, which is not being an entity other than the aggregates. So for this one, it's important that we understand this one as deeply, if you will, or as thoroughly as we did number 1. And we spent so much time on number 1 because it's the most common misapprehension that we do. But one has to say, as we now talk about number 2, if we can firmly establish through these meditation practices we've previously done that the self or I cannot be found in the aggregates of ourself or even in phenomena like with the chariot, then it has to be something other than that. There's no other option. It has to be something other than that. So that's why number 2 is so important, because this is the meditation where not being an entity, meaning the self or I, other than the aggregates, that's what we're negating. So in this one, we are going to do a quick meditation, just like we did the beginning of last session on the number 1. And then the other 5, we're going to just talk through quickly, and then I'm going to have to leave it to you guys to work with on your own. And again, that will be part of the last set of meditations that get put forth in the handout related to this last session. So what we will do now, just for a few minutes, is do a quick meditation. And with that, I ask all of you to just put yourself in a comfortable, relaxed, physical, mental state, whether you're sitting in meditation posture or in the chair. Just try to disconnect from the Zoom session and taking notes, etc., except for listening to my voice. And sit up straight. Try to relax your body. Do a big, quick scan from head to toe. And then focus on your breath. Your course level breath moving in and out. noticing it as it passes your nostrils and as it comes in, filling your lungs and abdomen. Slow that in and out process down. And with it, feel your body relaxing even more. And imagine that breath taking on an even finer, lighter quality than your normal coarse level breath, and that it permeates your entire body. So that as you breathe in, it fills not only your lungs and abdomen, but your entire body, head to toe, your limbs, all the way out to your fingertips and all the way down to your toes. And as a natural result of that, your body becomes light as well. Translucent light, bright, translucent light. The only thing holding you here is so that you don't just float away is the meditation practice. Use your breath to stay with me and your sense of listening to hear the meditation practice and simply take it in. So this meditation that I'll guide us through is the analytical meditation, the second one of Chandrakirti's sevenfold reasoning analytical process of establishing that the self or I is not different from mind and body. In other words, now that we've established in the first meditation practice of the sevenfold reasoning that the self or I is not the aggregates of mind and body, we now look to see if it could be found elsewhere. So the first reasoning goes like this. The self or I is not something or an entity other than the aggregates of mind and body. Because if it were, the self or I could not possibly have the character of the aggregates, such as we know them through previous meditations on the individual aggregates, the aggregates of form, perception, feelings, mental construction, or consciousness. And those characteristics, you might remember, are such as production, meaning that they arise, come into existence, continue to exist, and then disintegrate. This is reason number one. Reason number two. The self or the I is not a separate thing or entity from the aggregates, the mental and physical aggregates, because if it were, there would be no basis for the designation of a self or I. The I would be a non-product. And non-products are changeless, whereas the I obviously changes moment by moment, along with the production, abiding, and disintegration of our experience of each one of the aggregates. So how could an I be separate from the aggregates in this sense? That without the aggregates, there'd be no basis for the designation of the self or I. Reason number 3. The self or I is not a separate thing or entity from the aggregates of mind and body, because if it were, there would be no object to be apprehended as I. The I would be a non-product, like nirvana, or a non-existent, like a flower in the sky. In other words, where would we find the I if it cannot be found in designation with the aggregates? There would be no object to be apprehended as I. And the fourth and final reasoning, the I or self is not a separate entity from the aggregates, because if it were, the I would be apprehendable apart from the aggregates, just as the character of form is apprehendable separate from the character of consciousness. In other words, one can apprehend the object, the individual objects that make up the 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental constructions, and consciousness. One can apprehend each one of these separate from each other. But the I is not apprehendable apart from the aggregates. This is the meditation on establishing the self or I as not different from the aggregates or the mind and body. It's the second of the sevenfold reasoning meditations. So now bring your focus through my voice, my guided voice, back to your breath. Feel the weight of your body and form coming back to you as you normally experience it, and come back to the room. And we'll say that this is a taste of this second meditation practice, the second of the sevenfold reasoning. And obviously, quick walkthrough because of our time constraints. And if one were to spend more time with this, just like you might with the first set that I gave out last session, where there were six individual reasonings within that first reasoning of the self or I trying to find the self or I among the aggregates individually or collectively. Then this one, the second one, has 4. And you can take each one of those separately into a meditation session. You don't have to walk through all 6 in this case of the first reasoning, or in the case of the second reasoning, you don't have to take all 4 into a single meditation session. That might seem obvious, but again, the reason for the meditation, that as we did it today, is to just give you a taste of each. Each one of those are a separate analysis, just like in the first one, there are those 6 analysis. And if you don't recall them, they're in that handout from last session. So just to underscore again, these are the 2 primary analytical meditation processes that Chandrakirti's sevenfold reasoning system has. And what one does with these meditations is you try to study the topic as best you can from the lectures I've given, and then I'm going to review, which I haven't done yet, at the end of the session here, some of the additional reading that you can do. I've avoided it, and I told you why in previous sessions, because the topic, as presented in most of these texts, are mind benders for one reason or another. And so my hope is that in presenting the material in the way that I have, it introduces you to the topic where you could feel comfortable with it, and then you can move into some further exploration of the topic. Again, maybe by revisiting these lectures, but then also by following up with your own further study, and then reflection, and then doing these individual meditation processes. You can work with any of the ones from the first or second session, which are really good, solid meditations on the individual aggregates, but only from the perspective of that first reasoning, which is helping one to see that the self or I is not the aggregates. So for the second one, we have to rely more fully on each one of these 4 analysis and exploring them. What normally would happen, in my experience, and many other practitioners, is that by doing any one of these 4 that we just covered in a single session, it will bring some clarity to affirming the inferential existence of non-self. But it also will be like, what? I don't agree with that, or I don't get that. And that's where one needs to study the topic more. And again, at the beginning of this session, I tried to frame for you why you would do that, meaning create some motivation as to why it's so important, and therefore why you would even spend time on it. And that goes back to like breaking the innate, habitual way we misapprehend every single moment of our existence, and how it's important to break that. So that's some advice at the end of that walkthrough in terms of how to work with these meditations. And there's a lot more I could say about them, but we don't have time, which I keep saying. Sorry about that. So yeah, it's really important to just understand fully that what the sevenfold reasoning process of analytical meditation here is, that it's trying to bring you to a certain set of conclusions. And as Chandrakirti says, just to underscore some of what I was saying, might be a little redundant, but it's important. He says that concerning the subject, which is the person, that's what we're trying to analyze here in terms of how it truly exists, it follows that it is not inherently existent because it does not exist in any of these 7 ways. So he's underscoring that, hey, this system was developed to give you a set of analytical meditations that's a foolproof way to essentially, once you go through them, he's saying that you will not be able to find a self, an inherently existent, fixed, permanent self anywhere. And there's lots of big, thick treatises and debate logic text written over centuries by different sides arguing the details of this. And some of the text even that I put in the readings, are some of those texts. You can read them and you can become part of that dialogue, which might be a process that helps you further clarify the topic. But again, I caution you that best to do those under the guidance of somebody who knows those texts. They can get pretty complex. So he further says that whatever does not exist in any of these 7 ways is necessarily non-inherently existent, i.e. not inherently existent. Again, he's getting to that. What you can conclude is that there's an absence of inherently existent self or phenomena that you will experience. It's an experiential thing. You come to sort of the end of the analysis and there's no more to do. And this doesn't get talked about enough, at least in my experience of studying these meditations. And it's that point that once you reach that point, as Chandrakirti says, this means that any phenomena, meaning self or all other phenomena, which cannot be found to exist in any one of these 7 ways, must not be inherently existent. Put another way, it means that if a phenomena were inherently existent, it would have to exist in one of these 7 ways. So I'm beating a dead horse here, but I'm pulling everything into this logic of like, where do you end up at the end of any one of these meditations? If you then take them, not like the way we just did a review meditation, because that just is to give you a taste, but really work with each one. Once you get to that experience of negating what the idea is, which is establishing that the self or I, in the case of these meditations, is not the aggregates, then you simply relax in that experience. You move beyond the analytical process that is the sevenfold reasoning, especially the first and second reasonings. You move beyond it, meaning what? You take that experience into that second aspect of the actual meditation practice. Remember that in the first session, I explained to you that this type of meditation in the threefold process of learning, practicing reflection, meaning doing further study, and then doing meditation, that third step had two parts: the analytical, which is this. And then when you reach that comfort with the conclusion of the intended analysis, you simply relax with it, be with it, ideally just become one with it. It's experiential. It stops being analytical. Meditation at that point should become of the nature I just described. It then becomes deep. It then becomes something that you experience versus something that you just talk about and analyze and try to intellectually and conceptually understand. Because we're trying to move past conceptions that we normally experience, those habitual conceptions. So this is the deep part of the practice of this type of meditation, this part 2. And so this isn't a set of meditations you might take and do for a week and then go, okay, where are the next meditations I'm going to do? You can do these meditations over a long period of time. You can do them as doubts or fuzziness crop up relative to how you're experiencing your understanding of non-self. But it is essential to do that second part of the meditation practice, because that's what allows you to get up off the cushion, meaning the meditation session, and bring this as a fundamental frame of reference that's now changed, which is now transformed from that non-analytical, non-informed, not based on analysis that you do in the 7-4, you can bring it into your everyday experience, married with other practices, which I'm going to talk about at the end here, because that's really where you can find liberation from suffering. So it's important to know that that is the place that you want. That should be your goal in terms of how to use these reasonings. The reasonings aren't so that you get stuck in some intellectual process of analysis that you get down pat intellectually, which you might if you only do the analytical part of these, which is not the goal. The goal is that that's a vehicle to get to the experiential practice of these reasonings. So what I'm going to do now is I am going to just quickly walk through the other 5 reasonings. Let me put these back up on the screen. Okay. So that's 3 through 7 here. And by the way, I'll hand these out. And that's also point out where you can find these meditations in a couple of other texts. Some of you might already have them. And then we'll go into that a little bit more. And that will reinforce that there's some support after this course is over that you can rely on to further explore understanding that you need in the 3-stage process of learning and studying further. Because if that's shaky, it's difficult to do some of these meditations, right? So number 3, and again, I'm just going to talk through these very quickly, not being the base of the aggregates. So this essentially is, we're trying to establish that the I is not the base of the aggregates or the mind and body. And each one of these, the next 2 have only one meditation, and then the next 2 after that have 2, and then the last one has 1. So we can go through these quickly. So the reasoning for this is as follows. The self or I is not inherently the base of the mental and physical aggregates. And there's an analogy here. It's like a bowl for yogurt. or anything else that you might put in a bowl, or like snow that exists throughout and surrounds a forest of trees. So just think about that image. Or like snow that exists throughout and surrounds a forest of trees. Because if it were, the I or self and the aggregates would be different entities. And then this has already been refuted in the last number 2 reasoning that we did. So we could see, we don't have to twist our brains about trying to really dig into this one. I'm framing it for you, that these analogies of the bowl and the yogurt and the forest and the snow are a reinforcement of number 2. So number 3 is a subset based on number 2. And when we use that logic that's stated in those analogies, and when we use the concluding the conclusion, then, and as it states in Chandrakirti's text, that this has already been refuted in the second reasoning, that tells you right away that you don't really want to be doing this one until you have gone through the set of 4 in the second reasoning and have become familiar with them and can experience them. So that when he says they've already been refuted in the second reasoning, you'll go, and it will be a lot easier for you. Then also, when you actually hear and then just sit with the bowl and yogurt analogy and the snow and forest analogy, you'll get it. You'll go, So the goal is not to present this to you now where you might get it. Some of you might already know these meditations or you get it. But if you don't, then it's an indication that as you're moving forward with trying to do these meditations, you go back and make sure you really have a firm footing in number 2. And remember, this is clearly, Chandrakirti is literally telling us that this is what's already been established. So it's a variation on that. Remember, I told you 3 through 7 are variations, right? So enough about that one. Then the next one, number 4, is not inherently being based on the aggregates, or establishing that the mind and body are not the base of the I. So it just sort of said the other way around. The one reasoning here is as follows. The self or I is not inherently based on the aggregates, like, here's another simile, like a person living in a tent, or like a lion living in a forest. Because if it were, the self or I in the aggregates would be different entities. And again, this has already been refuted in the second reasoning. So, short speak, number 4 is reinforcement for number 2, just like number 3. Then number 5, not inherently possessing the aggregates, or establishing that the I or self does not inherently possess the mind and body, saying the same thing. So there are 2 reasonings. The first, the I does not inherently possess the aggregates in the way that a person possesses a cow. Because if it did, the I and the aggregates would be different entities. And then the second reasoning is the I or self does not inherently possess the aggregates in the way that a person possesses his body or a tree, its core, because then the I and the aggregates would inherently be the same. And these positions were already refuted in both the second and the first reasonings. So this one is reinforcement for both 1 and 2. And number 6, there's also 2 reasonings here. This is not being just the composite of the aggregates, or said another way, establishing that the I is not the composite of mind and body. First reasoning, the I or self is not just the composite of the aggregates because the aggregates are the basis of the designation I or self. And an object designated is not its basis of designation. It can't be. And then the second reasoning is the I or self is not the composition of the aggregates because the composition of the aggregates does not inherently exist. If the composition of the aggregates were inherently one with the aggregates, the composition would be many like the aggregates, or the aggregates would be one like the composition. Also, if the composition of the aggregates were a different entity from the aggregates, it would be apprehendable apart from the aggregates and would not have the character of the aggregates. But this is not so. And again, this logic, these reasonings reinforce both 1 and 2. And that second reasoning obviously has some subset statements of argument to be that one could take and just meditate on one at a time. So we could say there's 2 reasonings there, and there are, but the second one has a subset of rational statements, logical statements to make it so. And so that's another way one can parse your meditation practices of these individual reasonings. And then the last one is not being the shape of the aggregates or establishing that the I is not the shape of the body. I left out the word mind there because this one's more about form. So the reason is the I is not the shape of the body because shape is physical. And if the I or self were merely physical, it would not be conscious. Also, the shape of a body does not inherently exist because it is a composite of the shapes of the limbs and of the body. So that last part of the reasoning we covered in the very first meditation we did on form. So some of this might stick a little bit or a lot, depending on how much you might have done some of those meditations. But again, here it's meant to just give you an overview of the other 7. So with that said, we now have the set of tools that make up the type of meditation practice one can do to wrestle with and grapple with sorry, that's the wrong screen. The 3 poisons. And why would we want to correct this if indeed it's true? And that goes to what we're going to circle back to what Mr. Harrison talked about in terms of what this change of innate habitual mistaken identity can lead to. So I bring up this last graph about, some of you might be familiar with this if you took my course last year on the Wheel of Life. And obviously you could tell by some of my references back to this course and back to some of the materials in that course that there's a reason why I taught that course last winter, and then I'm teaching this course now. That course was meant to show you how life works, and that fundamentally one of the things one has to work with, along with compassion. Remember, I talked in a previous session about the two wings of compassion and wisdom. We're here trying to correct misapprehension or ignorance that then is transformed into wisdom, which is an important ingredient in how we should be practicing and moving forward in our lives to make our lives happier and better lives. So I bring this up with some purpose. Here, there's an illustration of the three poisons in the middle. Again, going on and on and on. And these inform experientially, whether you're living through one lifetime or in some of the traditions that this practice is connected to, like in Buddhism, we've been here as sentient beings since beginningless time. It could be applied to lifetime to lifetime. So I'll jump out to the outer ring here. And these 12 little circles are what occurs based on what happens in the inner wheel of life being experienced through misapprehension. Because at the top, the first one, it's a blind person walking. They're blind because they are not seeing how things really are, like Mr. Harrison talks about. And as we've been talking about here, trying to cure by using the sevenfold reasoning meditation practice. That leads to the second process, which is karmic activity. Now, that's why I talked in previous sessions about karma and how things really work karmically. Every moment we experience, we're creating karma, placing kleshas in our mind stream, and then they ripen. They ripen through the potter. There's an image of a potter here normally. Maybe I have that. Let me see if I have that. Yeah, here. Here's the blind person. Here's the potter. Probably can't see that. Sorry, it's probably small. But those karmic experiences are shaping our conceptual reality that we experience in our mind stream. And that's represented here by a series of other images, which I won't go into too depth because otherwise I'll start reteaching the course that I've already taught. But essentially, know that it leads to conceptual thinking based on misapprehension of how things really are. That leads to our experience of words and images in our arising moment by moment thoughts that are just happening endlessly. And then working in connection with our sense perception, which is the next circle, we dependently experience things. But without having that word or image in our mind stream already, we wouldn't be able to experience that, using our sense perception. We wouldn't be able to experience whatever that object is, whether it's our own self or something external from us. And then this leads to, engagement in life. Contact with others is represented by two lovers kissing. That leads to judgment and fixation, which leads to suffering, and also habitual behavior of craving and attraction and clinging to things. That's what all, I'm not going through these in detail, including conception and then birth and then aging, sickness and death. And then in a Buddhist point of view, that leads to an endless cycle that goes on and on and on and on until we're able to cure that by understanding how things really work. But what's in the middle here, as we're going through life, misinformed by the three poisons, we experience these various realms. And here they're put in the context of actual realms, but we can think of them as states of mind, mental afflictions that are constantly arising in each one of our minds, moment by moment, that have the characteristics of one of these realms. And I provided a detailed walkthrough of those in this previous course that I taught, and then that informs how there's certain meditation practices one can do that I shared with all of you who took that course that one can work with as an antidote to those afflictive mental states, thereby creating, happier, more peaceful existence and states of mind. So you can see how life works as represented in the Wheel of Life is connected to the topic of what we're studying here. And I have to connect them. Sorry for some of you who haven't taken this course and maybe aren't familiar with the Wheel of Life, but I encourage you to explore it. There's some text that I gave out in the readings at the beginning of this course that you can read. And then you could also look at my course, and there's lots of courses on that topic, because it will inform reason and give you context and give you clarity in terms of how life really works, as far as why it might make sense to take the time to do what Mr. Harrison is showing us in his world, which is, I'll end the session here by just going back to quoting Mr. Harrison as I have in previous sessions at the beginning of each session. Here, I'll do it at the end. So he says, suddenly I looked around and everything I could see was relative to my ego, like that's my piece of paper and that's my flannel, or give it to me, or I am. And then he said, it drove me crackers. I hated everything about my ego. We talked about that. Everything was false and impermanent. So he was able to see the impermanent nature of things, which is what is a natural outcome, by the way, of doing the sevenfold reasoning practice. You don't need to use LSD. You can permanently, through doing the type of 2-stage meditation practice I mentioned earlier, to have a thorough and complete experience and new frame of reference of seeing things impermanently. That might sound bad, but it's seeing things the way they really are. And once informed by seeing things the way they really are, and not be fooling yourself thinking everything is based on inherently being fixed and permanent and having a non-changing nature, you can work then with that. And so the last quote from Mr. Harrison was that everything you see and do and touch and smell isn't real. So that kind of connects to like that thing he said a moment ago about everything being impermanent, and he didn't like it and it drove him crackers. Well, that doesn't have to be the way it is. If you utilize the techniques we taught in this course and work with the tools that have been given to you, and you put them into the context of understanding how things really work, like described here in the Wheel of Life, and most important, because things are impermanent, we can actually change how things arise for us karmically. They're not fixed. There's nothing set in stone. There's nothing predetermined, in the sense that once one has this wisdom of awareness of how things really work, you can use that as a basis to supercharge your mindful moment by moment experience of life through correct vision of how things are really happening, to alleviate the predispositions you already have to mistakenly see things. They can be alleviated. They can be put in off to the side and never have to ripen. And in their place, sort of push them out of the way and put moment by moment experience of seeing how things really work, which they are impermanent. But because they're impermanent, you can imbue them with wisdom of how things really are, learned in this course, as the foundation, you can then go about populating your moment by moment experience informed by that with creations of new predispositions, karmic dispositions that have better quality to it. Qualities of virtuous activity, which is represented here on this side of the semicircle wheel surrounding the inner wheel of the three poisons, and have that take on qualities that you know are good. Your speech, your thoughts, your actions can be imbued on that foundation with being ethical, moral, generous, practicing inner and external compassionate activities, all informed by wanting to not only help yourself, but to help others who, all of us, live in this reality that we've discussed during this course. It's not just you and me. We all live in this mistaken frame of reference, moment by moment. It's quite insidious. So one can use knowledge gained here as a basis to skillfully and mindfully have your future right now, especially once you've done these meditations and you've gained some wisdom from them, meaning that experience that I talked about after you do the analytical part, taking them into your moment by moment reality and changing all your future predispositions, those karmic ripenings that we talked about. You can do that right now. That's where we have the power to change what Mr. Harrison was alluding to, never got to in terms of what he was talking about, why it was so important to understand the true nature of reality. But this is the reason why. It's the reason why you can live virtuously, you can practice compassion, you can understand the nature of suffering and where it comes from, coming from the three poisons, and understanding that and actively participating in breaking what that means for yourself. Share that in your own moment by moment experience with yourself and with all others in your life. And that's what brings happiness. Happiness is nothing more than that, in the sense that you now understand how things work. You correct how you view life moment by moment through the lens of wisdom, which is getting rid of this misapprehension caused by the three poisons, and then further, specifically the boar or pig, and then further brought out normally by either grasping to things or pushing things away ignorantly. We can work with changing exactly what we do moment by moment. And that's where, in the subtitle of the course, we can proceed with finding real and lasting happiness. That's what makes it lasting. Not that you change things into being permanent. It's actually an understanding impermanence, that you understand the true nature of things and be able to work with them with wisdom, with skill. And then it's up to you. What do you fill your moment by moment container with, experiential container with? Do you fill it with ethical and moral and generous and kind, compassionate activities of body, speech, and mind, which are the virtuous activities here? Or do you fill them with self-grasping, this is mine, whether it's that's my chocolate bar you ate, and that was mine. Or you're Vladimir Putin and you're like, that's my country, I'm taking it back. It goes the full breadth of experience in terms of why we live in a suffering existence, from the most mundane, trivial reality of my chocolate bar to somebody who's on the verge of starting World War III. So we have to have compassion for everyone who suffers the same misapprehension, and do practices that bring us to a place of where can I help myself? And where can I help all other sentient beings change the way they mistakenly experience life and therefore cause suffering? That's where real happiness is found. It's not just something you're getting for yourself. And that's why this practice is married in some of these traditions that come from the West, like as from the East, like yoga and like certain Buddhist practices and other martial arts practices, and that I talked about at the beginning of the course. That's why there's always the element present of compassion. It's not about yourself and finding happiness just for yourself. That's not even possible. It only is possible by marrying this wisdom of understanding how things really work, of knocking down these habitual conceptions of mistakenly seeing things the way we normally do, marrying that with the other practice of compassion for yourself, taking it from where you are and taking one step forward and making change that you're now empowered to make, and also with others, not just with yourself. So this is kind of where all of this intellectual process of studying the nature of self leads to. It should lead first at the end of these reasoned meditation practices to experiencing life the way, experiencing the meditation practice the way that we said we should strive for, which is having that familiarity and comfort with the conclusion, the inferential knowledge of non-self. But then what does that mean? Where do I take that? That's what I rushed through in the last 5 or 10 minutes in my narrative, but it's important because that's what connects this very, very important transformational practice of discovering what Harrison talks about, of like the true nature of everything. Then this is really what then that's the platform that you can then build this kind of moment by moment life on, this whole transformation of your karmic ripening, your predispositions. So a lot to squeeze in, very, very, very condensed. But I felt if I didn't do that today, the contextualization, putting it into context, this remains then like a mental exercise detached from experience. And then my subtitle to the course, discovering how we mistakenly experience ourselves in the world and in the process find real and lasting happiness, then it was just a come on. It doesn't make sense. So maybe still fuzzy for some of us, but I wanted to give it that sort of frame of reference. Maybe poorly said, but I did my best. So let me see if we have some questions. There's a bunch of things in the chat. So we'll go as quickly as we can, but hopefully Dan Kale can let us go a few extra minutes if we have to as well. So Richard's asking, can you repeat what you said was the summation of the first 10 minutes of this talk? You said it is not but the itself that is. Well, hard for me to go back that far, but I can tell you the first sentence, Richard, that I did state at the beginning. It was peppered with a lot of injection by me, which is my style. I won't do that here, but I did say, it is not the object of observation, but rather the conception itself that is the causal factor in bringing about suffering. So that's that quote. Next question here is from Rachel. She says, what is it that gathers or attracts karma? Yeah, great question. It's obviously not self. Well, it's the mistaken moment by moment experience of the consciousness, our subtle consciousness, which is part of our nature, that as it has arisings appear to it, whether it's an internal process of arising or external, that we cling to it or we push it away. That is the nature of the three poisons. And that causes all the problems. That's actually what causes karma, whether it's good, bad, or mixed, as it was shown in the semicircles of virtuous and non-virtuous activity. So it's the fundamental, what gathers it is this misapprehension. If ultimately in Buddhism, if one were to truly go beyond inferential knowledge of non-self, like truly go beyond that to a direct experience of non-self, not only then does one reach the place, if you will, where they swap out predispositions that are uninformed by the three poisons, but one actually, with good or better karma, which is what I just talked about at the end, but we actually completely end the predispositions even ever arising. We end karma. And in Buddhism, that conceptually is known as reaching nirvana. You never have to have any good, bad, or indifferent or mixed karma experiences ever. You go beyond conception. Conception is rooted in ignorance, and conception creates clinging and aversion. And that's what creates the 12 links of dependent origination that I showed you in that last diagram. So in a sense, when you say it's obviously not self, when you say not self, if you're thinking of not self, then you're right. And versus self or I. And so I'm taking it to the next step, which you didn't ask, which is then what actually happens if you directly experience non-self, you actually move beyond karma. So then there is no gathering and attracting of karma, which is actually in Buddhism, that's called reaching nirvana. And when you really remove all the subtle, what are called obscurations of that process of going beyond taking on new karma, then you reach the state of omniscience, which is considered in Buddhism, reaching the state of Buddhahood, which is a state that is attainable by ordinary sentient beings. The Buddha was an ordinary sentient being that reached that state. So that hopefully, I think that answers your question. Next question was, can we use the sevenfold reasoning for ourself and for all other phenomena? Are all other living beings in the phenomena category? That's a good question. The answer is yes. I tried to explain that a bit in my talk, meaning that we can use this reasoning for self and for all other phenomena, and that's why we do the process of the around self first is most important. But it's why I gave the external object of a chariot as an example of other phenomena. And as far as your second point goes, all other living beings in the phenomena category, technically, yes, in the sense that they dependently arise on what we experience internally as we interact with those living beings, just like any other object. So there isn't anything in existence. Let me put it this way. There isn't anything in existence that one cannot use the sevenfold reasoning on in terms of a meditation practice of then understanding self and others and all phenomena. Also somebody's asking, same person's asking, can I include the wheel diagram 9 in handout? Yes, I'll send that along. I'll send along a few others too. That one is one of many, and actually is missing one of the circles, that particular one. It's missing the virtuous and non-virtuous circle. Also then, David, to everyone, actions create karma. Causes and condition produce ripening. Yes. Yes, he's asking. Yes. Yeah, actions create karma, but I want to define actions as being anything that is one generates in one's thoughts, speech, or action. So I'm defining physical action. So I'm defining actions as any of those moment by moment activities one can do in the conceptual realm. Underscore, it has to happen in the conceptual realm. And we live in the conceptual realm. So of course it would. So it's not just action. Some people think of actions as just doing things that you do, but they can be thoughts and speech. And then there's a whole bunch of subset of criteria that one has to have that follow what are called the laws of karma that make it so that that action of body, speech, and mind can stick, if you will, in the mind stream of a sentient being. So, and then once it does, then you've created the causes, and then the conditions to produce ripening. You lump them together there. You say causes and condition. The causes are planted then, and then the conditions is the continuing misapprehension of how things really work, which lead to continually clinging to and having aversion to and discrimination and all the mental afflictive states that we know: anxiety, jealousy, hatred, anger. I mean, the Buddha identified 84,000 specific mental afflictive states. So those are the conditions that we alleviate by doing this practice. And that's another motivating factor. So I'm glad you brought that up, because that will reduce the ripening of karma already planted. It doesn't have to ripen. That's why doing these practices sooner rather than later, I urge you to do them, because that can change what is already in your already planted kleshas, if you will, meaning causes are already set there, and then the conditions of ripening. Remember last time I talked about like watering, nurturing, fertilizing karmic seeds that have been planted. Well, you can starve them to death. You can put them out in the desert and have them not grow by not aiding and abetting them with conditions that produce ripening. And these practices of understanding the true nature of self are one of the most powerful practices you can do to starve off already planted crops of karmic ripening. And then let's see, next comment that came through as a follow-up to previous question is, but what is it that collects or retains the karma? That's a good question. In these systems that we're talking about, this kind of practice existing in, there is in the conventional functional realm of existence, conceptual existence, there is two. Well, there's more than two, but I'll put it into two. There's the gross level consciousness of a sentient being, which we all can identify clearly as something that comes and goes, comes into existence, right? You're born, you abide, meaning you live, and then you age, you get sick, and then you die, meaning your gross, consciousness. But there is a subtle consciousness that that continues. And this goes back to, I think it was your question actually too, Rachel, about like equating, how does this fit like with, the understanding we have maybe of like what actually continues? Is there a soul? Is there a self that does have existence, that does have a positive, that is there? And so in a lot of these practices like yoga and Buddhism and others from the East, the answer is yes. There is even in the Wheel of Life teaching that we did, right? We did that a while ago. Last year, we talked about karma and how it's projected forward, even from one lifetime to another in that system, right? Because that system believes in reincarnation. Well, then what's carrying it forward, right? Something has to carry it forward. So the simple answer is yes, there is in this cosmology, there is a subtle consciousness that proceeds. Is it what we label it as in terms of what we've been talking about today? Is inherently self-existent, mistaken sort of self? It's not. So that's what we're exploring, and that can get confusing because that almost sounds like a contradiction. But that's another topic, and so I like to leave that one there, knowing that that would be a question, if you know what I mean. Another one here says that very most subtle consciousness, which is the mental continuum. Yeah, words are tricky here, mental continuum, but most subtle consciousness is in the sort of subtle anatomy, if you will, of a continuation of a sentient being is called the most subtle consciousness, not called mental continuum. That's a different concept, a different construct. And it's something that it might sound like I'm parsing words, but if you do explore further, then you'll understand that there is a reason for me making a big deal about that. But we can't talk about that further now. Karma's carried like a scent on the breeze. Credit to my teachers on that. Rephrased slightly by me. Yeah, that's good. That gives it that subtle, feeling that I wasn't really getting across. On the other hand, I like the idea of like something being planted in soil, and then it gets nursed and it gets nurtured, and what do we do that with? We're doing that with our lack of compassion and lack of understanding how things really work. And then the next one says, I know we're over time here, so we can stop if somebody tells me we have to stop, and I'll keep going. Could you repeat the 3 meditation steps? Yeah, so there is the 3 steps are pretty much about the process we do in learning, and then taking it all the way through to the level of experiencing directly, whatever the topic is. So it's not 3 meditative steps, it's 3 steps. It's the step of learning, which is why, studying is really important. And then it's taking the next step of reflecting, studying further on your own. And then the 3rd step is meditation. And in this practice, there's 2 steps to the 3rd step of meditation, which is analytical meditation, which is what the 7-fold reasoning meditation is. And then once we get comfortable with each one of those meditations, we then take it further into just being with the results of that. And in the case of these meditations, it's reaching a point where there's the experience of non-self. There's not a self there. There's not an I there. And these analytical processes take you to that experience. So more can be.
Let me ask you a question.
Sure.
So there is no self, okay? Now the practical manifestation of the fact that there is no self is like, let's say, when there is anger, means there's no such a thing as I'm angry. Now, once you reach that understanding and you want to go into the experiential mode of non-self, okay? What is it? What's the entity that's observing the anger? What's the entity that's observing things that it's not you?
Well, in the conceptual realm of only reaching inferential experience of non-self, not direct experience, we are, and that by definition is the suffering realm. In Buddhism, it's called samsara. And by definition, that realm is conceptual. In that realm, you cannot help but mistakenly be, when you do that process you just described, technically you're experiencing it conceptually, and that experience is a mistaken process. Maybe it's informed by having an experience of understanding that it is mistaken, but you cannot experience it any further than inferentially. And that's where, in the process of understanding this topic, there's two stages. One is inferential, and then one is direct. And then direct, we haven't even talked about in this course. And that cannot be done in the conceptual realm. That can only be done in very deep levels of meditation that go beyond the conceptual realm.
Yes, so that's the question. How do
Yeah,
you do it? How do you do it in a direct
yeah,
level?
that's another course. And I'm not being flippant when I say that. It's there are practices that yogis of different traditions, and in my tradition, Buddhism, do that directly go to, Ron, what you're asking me, and not for here to get into, but glad to talk to you about that separately and give you some advice if you're interested in that.
No, because it's not only that I'm interested, because unless you are able to practice on a direct level, all what we study will still remain only on the intellectual level. So even though you say we have to move beyond the intellectual level, we will always be in the quagmire of the intellectual level unless we start practicing on the direct level.
Yep, I agree with you on one level, but on another level, on the day-to-day normal level of experience, I disagree with you, because in the conceptual realm, karma always is working. And within the context of understanding the wheel of life, in curing through conceptual intellectual process, taken all the way through to meditative practices on dissolving ignorance represented by the pig or boar, and then that alleviating the rest of the mental afflictions, one can bring oneself in the conceptual realm, duly noted, not directly, to a much higher quality of life that does lead, listen to this, lead potentially and eventually to direct experience of the nature of what we're talking about here. So you're right, but also it doesn't mean the practice, doing certain practices within the conceptual realm, which, by the way, all of the great masters like Jesus and Buddha and other teachers have given us, are all meant to be practiced in the conceptual realm, so we can move in a direction which is called the path. That's the fourth of the Buddha's Four Noble Truths, that we can use the basis, which is normal conceptual reality, towards reaching nirvana. So this has purpose. You're right, but also I want to underscore that it doesn't negate the vibrancy and wonderful potentials that exist in the Buddha's teaching and other great masters.
Okay, so let's for example, how would you conceptually, in the conceptual realm, how would somebody deal with, let's say, not be offended? It says, well, there's no self, so I'm not being offended, but something's happening, and it's hurting me, it's causing me pain, okay? It's causing me offense, shame, anger. So conceptually, in practicality, how would you separate so you don't suffer from the shame or the offense or the anger or that? So let's do it conceptually. How would you do it conceptually?
Well, sure. And first of all, it must be said that even though normal, everyday conceptual experiences are just like ultimately those everyday experiences don't have, they have a nature of non-self. It doesn't negate the function that occurs moment by moment for all of us, which is all things and people and events and dependent arising realities function between people and between us and others. And so you can't like negate that. What you can do is you can change the nature of what that experience is by identifying the mental afflictive state that's involved, do certain meditative practices as an antidote to that, and reach a place where your moment by moment experience is has much less mental afflictive states present moment by moment. And a lot of those meditative practices I covered in the Wheel of Life teaching that I did, and also as another single source reference, which is almost like a toolbox for such things. The Buddhist canon has an entire set of Lojong practices, mind training practices, which are an antidote to that. So these are things that one, has to look into and investigate. And because of time, we can't really explore it much further here. We kind of have to leave it at that. So I appreciate those questions, Ron. And these are things that I've talked about a lot over time. So I'm very comfortable and capable of talking about them, but we kind of have to leave it there because we're 15 minutes over time here. And a lot of you had to leave. So I wanted to say goodbye to everybody who took the course, and sorry that we went so long, but I would encourage you to look specifically, this is the last thing I'll do, at the for further depth of understanding about this specific practice, the sevenfold reasoning practice, and the subsequent practices, meditative practices of dependent arising, and and also the practice of real quick, the practice of diamond slivers, and all the reasoning that goes with those. I highly recommend this book here, which is Meditation on Emptiness. The meditations that I gave, and they're in the reference reading list that I gave you. So please, realize that it is a pretty dense book. It's wording and terminologies wrapped in certain type of conceptual wording that one might go, what's he talking about, etc. So then you have to be patient with yourself, but the sevenfold reasoning meditation practice is in there, and also the dependent arising and the diamond slivers are in there, and they're all right in the beginning of the book. The rest of the book is like expounds. So that's why I caution you to be careful with using these kind of texts, but if you feel up to it, something you can explore. And that's the one that I would highly recommend, as it tackles this subject directly, and provides deeper context in terms of reasoning, et cetera, that I tried to boil down to a relatable level in terms of how we could apply it to our day-to-day lives. So let's leave it at that. Hopefully no other questions, right? Can we leave it at that? I think a few other people said thank you and goodbye, which is nice. I appreciate it. Sorry we couldn't all say goodbye together, but I will still do my end of practice a dedication, which should make some sense to you guys as it relates to changing the way we look at things in terms of moving forward and planting seeds that have a better outcome than what maybe we're habitually used to. So my dedication very quickly is, by the goodness of the deed I have just done, may all sentient beings complete the collection of merit and wisdom. And by this gain, the ultimate bodies that wisdom and merit make. May what we've learned here today be wholly dedicated to the future well-being and happiness of all sentient beings, where there is no longer any suffering existence and only happiness and endless joy. So that wraps up this session. I still do have office hours posted for anybody who wants to get together with me. I might send an email out where I suggest that I flip those office hours into meditation sessions where we do some of these meditations, because people might find that more beneficial than continuing to chat about this topic. So then we can, I'll send out a notice about that to everybody, and anybody who's didn't get that information, it's at the website, on the course listing page. There's one of the documents lists my office hours in a Zoom login. So that's it.
Thank you,
Thank
John.
you, everybody.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank
so
you,
much,
John.
Thank you,
right.
John.
Everybody be well.